Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. I'm Robert George. I have the honor to be the director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institution, which is hosting today our annual Elizabeth M. Whelan Lecture. Beth Whelan was a great friend of the Madison Program, and we're really proud to have this lecture named in her honor. She was one of the great public advocates of real science. And a defender against the worst forms of abuse of science. And to tell us a bit more about Beth, we have with us her husband, Steve Whelan, who is a founding father and a member of the advisory council of the James Madison Program. So without further ado, let me welcome to the podium Steve Whelan. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Robbie. For 43 years, it was my privilege to be married to Elizabeth Whelan, who people continue to describe years after her passing as a force of nature, everything that Robbie said and more. But let's go back to 1962, when I was a junior at the Hill School, sitting on a Sunday night, hearing an in-person speech by William F. Buckley, Jr., and being transfixed by his message. 2 years later, I was a freshman at Princeton, and my conservative classmates and I rallied to the cause of Barry Goldwater. Yes, we were mocked when the election results came in, but we had the last laugh 16 years later when Ronald Reagan and the Prairie Fire were elected in that seminal year. So Matt, I've been waiting 60 years for this book to come out. If Elizabeth were here, she would have been first in line, but since she couldn't make it, I was first in line to get your book. And I will now turn things over to Professor George for a more full introduction of Matt.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for all your support of the Madison Program over these many years. And we are so proud to host this lecture in honor of Beth. And now to introduce our distinguished 2022 Whelan Lecturer. Matthew Continetti is a senior fellow in the Patrick and Charlene Neal Chair in American Prosperity at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. He's the founding editor of the Washington Free Beacon, a contributing editor at Bill Buckley's magazine, National Review, and a columnist for Commentary magazine. He's been published in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post, among other distinguished outlets. He also appears frequently on the Fox News Channel's Special Report with Bret Baier and on NBC's Meet the Press with Chuck Todd. Mr. Continetti is the author of 3 books. First, The Persecution of Sarah Palin, How the Elite Media Tried to Bring Down a Rising Star, The K Street Gang, The Rise and Fall of the Republican Machine, and most recently, The Right, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism, for which there will be a signing just outside this room following the lecture. I am delighted to welcome to Princeton and the Madison Program, Matthew Continetti. Matthew.
Thank you, Robbie, and thank you, Stephen. Your story about supporting Goldwater in 1964 and the reaction of the student body reminded me of a story that's in my book. A little bit up a ways at Harvard, there was a liberal Democrat in 1964 who was so eager to indulge in schadenfreude over Goldwater's loss that he rushed to the library to get the latest copy of National Review to see how William F. Buckley Jr. and the editors would react. And that student's name is Charles Murray, who may be known or notorious to some of you in the audience. My book is The Right is about the past of conservatism. Today I want to talk a little bit about the present and potentially the future. Ed Feulner co-founded the Heritage Foundation in 1973 and served as its president from 1977 to 2013. He used to issue periodic reports on the state of conservatism that had the structure and cadences of presidential State of the Union addresses. Feulner would begin by discussing the conservative movement's achievements. Then he would transition to conservatism's challenges. He would repeat conservative principles, and then he would conclude with an appeal for conservative action. Conservatism, in Feulner's view, may have been sectarian, it may have faced setbacks, but the future always remained bright for a movement dedicated to constitutionalism, limited government, the rule of law, and a strong national defense. Foellner's assessment of conservative strength depended a lot on the presidency. Ronald Reagan, in his telling, brought conservatism to the White House and mainstreamed its emphasis on freedom. Bill Clinton overreached in his first 2 years and inadvertently helped complete the Reagan Revolution by handing Congress to the GOP in 1994. The two presidents Bush had a more complicated relationship with conservatism. Bush the elder, in Foellner's telling, was a good man who too often made the mistake of abandoning conservative principle for a false liberal consensus. And Bush the younger was another good man whose political success, Foellner said, did not necessarily translate into conservative gains. Foellner lamented the big spending ways of George W. Bush and the GOP Congress. He criticized their enactment of the first major entitlement since the Great Society. At the midpoint of George W. Bush's administration, Foellner observed that, and I quote, "For too many conservatives in power, governing seems to have become a political rather than a principled exercise." When you go back and read Foellner's status reports, a few things stand out. The first is his confidence in conservatism's mission. Foellner belonged to a self-conscious political movement that he had joined as a young man. Its purpose was to overturn the legal misunderstandings, bureaucratic centralism, and woolly-headed globalism of LBJ's Great Society and ultimately FDR's New Deal. Foellner was part of a tradition and fought an action that included Russell Kirk and Frederick Hayek, William F. Buckley Jr., and Irving Kristol, Barry Goldwater, and Newt Gingrich. Foellner's proposed reforms aligned public policy with conservative values of choice, opportunity, growth, and competition. He emphasized economic and national security issues more than he did cultural ones. His greatest domestic concern was the size and scope of the federal government. According to Foellner, the best measure of conservatism's success or failure in each era was the degree to which it had slowed, arrested, or reined in the Leviathan state. In 2004, when Foellner wrote his last State of Conservatism piece, his normally self-confident prose contained a note of uncertainty. "This year," he said, "may be a decisive one for the conservative revolution." Emphasis on may. Foellner's tacit premise was that conservatism's future was up for grabs. He worried that Republicans had too readily accommodated themselves to big government. He held out hope that a re-elected George W. Bush and a Republican Congress would expand free trade, introduce personal accounts into Social Security, and constrain federal spending. He wanted the Bush Republicans to strengthen conservatism by limiting government and expanding economic, political, and religious freedom. Foellner did not know. Foellner could not have known what was ahead. We know. The misfire of Social Security privatization, Hurricane Katrina and President Bush's pledge to rebuild New Orleans no matter the cost, civil war and a surge of troops in Iraq, the global financial crisis, the Great Recession, and bailouts of banks, autos, and mortgage lenders, Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, the rise and fall of Paul Ryan's proposed changes to Medicare and Medicaid, the Bowles-Simpson Commission, remember that, and budget sequestration, the collapse of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Brexit and the 2016 election, the coronavirus pandemic and its $4 trillion in emergency spending, the contested 2020 election, Biden's inauguration, the $2 trillion American Recovery Plan Act, and the second coming of stagflation, the Inflation Reduction Act, at whose name George Orwell would smile, student debt forgiveness, critical race theory, and gender ideology. 18 years after the last State of Conservatism, America is a different place. And American conservatism is different too. It lacks Foellner's self-confident sense of purpose. It has, to put it charitably, mixed feelings about limited government. Many on the right believe that political power is all they have left, so why not use it? Conservatism, it seems, is just as ambivalent today about freedom. After all, a lot of perverse, harmful, and irrational behavior justifies itself in freedom's name. And the distemper extends abroad. Anti-communist foreign policy once unified conservatism. On the right these days, foreign policy is a source of debate, division, and enmity. Ronald Reagan's conservatism still exists, to be sure, but its philosophy of freedom finds itself in an overlapping and complicated relationship sometimes commingling, sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive and conflictual, with the ideas, impulses, animosities, and agenda of Donald Trump's populism. Indeed, I sometimes wonder whether there is a coherent conservative movement in America today. Is it possible to assess the strength of this movement in the tradition of Ed Feulner? I say that it is, if you are tolerant of conflict, complexity, and contradiction. What then is the state of conservatism in the year 2022? Let's begin on the surface. The Republican Party, the institutional vehicle of American conservatism, is poised for a comeback. It demonstrated surprise strength in 2020 when the GOP picked up 14 House seats and held the Senate to a 50-50 tie despite losing the presidency. The next year, 2021, Republicans shocked the political establishment. Glenn Youngkin became Virginia's first GOP governor-elect in 12 years. A relative unknown named Jack Ciattarelli came within 2 points of unseating the Democratic governor of this state. An even lesser-known candidate, my favorite candidate, truck driver Edward Durr, unseated New Jersey's powerful state Senate president. And Republicans gained in Nassau County, New York, on a program of support for law enforcement. The Republican comeback has continued into 2022. President Biden's approval rating is low. Inflation and crime are high. The southern border is an aspiration. After a rocky summer, Republicans have regained the lead in the congressional generic ballot. And the generic ballot typically understates Republican support. At this moment, according to Real Clear Politics, the GOP has vaulted into a 3-point lead on which party voters would like to see in control of Congress. Republicans are well ahead in the race for the House, and competitive Senate seats are within the margin of error. That is usually a good sign for the out party. I expect Republicans to win both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and to hold most governorships and state legislative seats when America votes on November 8th. The states are important because federalism allows for a remarkable amount of policy entrepreneurship. Yet our nationalized political conversation neglects conservative strength at the state and local level. Recall that Wisconsin and Michigan set the standard for the national welfare reform of 1996. And take note that earlier this year, Arizona instituted the most ambitious school choice program in history throughout their country. Red state governors kept schools open and masks optional during the pandemic. Texas and Florida became havens for economic migrants fleeing California and New York. It sometimes seems as if the governors of Texas and Florida are in an arms race, not just to see who can best troll the left, but who can come up with the best red state model of governance. Governor Ron DeSantis has proven to be an effective culture warrior as well as a more than competent chief executive. He and Governor Youngkin have led the charge to reform K-12 curricula. And changes to Florida's public undergraduate and graduate programs are sure to be made after Senator Ben Sasse takes his talents to Gainesville. By embracing universal school choice, charter schools, religious schools, homeschooling alternatives, by breaking up the accreditation cartel, and by constraining federal interference, education reform may wind up being the welfare reform of the 21st century, the field of social endeavor where conservatives make their greatest advances. But perhaps the most dizzying conservative success of recent times is found in the federal court system. The multi-generational development of originalist jurisprudence and professional networking bore its greatest fruit during this past Supreme Court term. The court not only reversed its holding in Roe v. Wade and restored abortion law to the democratic process, it also reasserted the individual right to bear arms, and it took aim at the heart of the administrative state with its ruling that Congress must speak clearly and directly to regulatory agencies such as the EPA, when delegating legislative authority. Next Monday, the court will hear arguments in cases that will determine the future of race-based college admissions and, in my view, of color consciousness in public life more generally. Based on the left's howls of protest regarding this and other hot topic cases set for this current term, the prognosis for affirmative action does not look good. It continues to amaze me that some people on the right do not account for, or else conveniently overlook, the tremendous gains in constitutional understanding that are being made right before our eyes. Yet much of the right indulges in pessimism these days. And this psychological turn is where we leave politics and law and enter territory where the state of conservatism is much more precarious and uncertain. Running alongside these political gains and constitutional victories is intellectual doubt and sectarianism. To speak of the conservative movement in 2022 is to describe a philosophical tendency in a condition of fracture and flux. For much of the history of the post-war conservative movement, figures such as William F. Buckley Jr. and Ronald Reagan performed an ecumenical service. They brought the right together. There is no leader on the scene right now who exercises a similar function. The best I can come up with is Ben Shapiro in media and Ron DeSantis in politics. But even there, as I can tell from your reaction, there is dissent. Rush Limbaugh, the voice of conservatism, has been silent for almost 2 years. None of his epiphanies have replaced him. Scandal has plagued core conservative institutions such as the NRA. American Catholics are divided, and personal foibles and politicization have rocked the evangelical Christian church. It can be hard to tell who belongs on the right and who does not. Membership in the Trump populist coalition depends most of all on one's posture toward the former president. That is why the term rhino has been drained of all meaning. It used to be that rhinos were liberal or moderate Republicans who deviated from conservative positions on taxes, life, or guns. Nowadays, rhino is more often used simply to describe a critic of Trump or MAGA. Now, it is true that pessimism is a constant temptation for conservatives. I'm often drawn to the words of that great philosopher, Woody Allen, who said, and I quote, "More than any other time in history, mankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness. The other, to total extinction. Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose wisely." And as the author of a book subtitled The 100 War for American Conservatism, I am more than aware that infighting on the right is not new. None of the different camps within American conservatism were ever as powerful as the others believed they were. And none of the intellectuals in American conservatism ever had as much of an influence as they might have liked, or may have thought they had, over the single-issue activist groups and Republican elected officials. And yet, if American conservatism was multifaceted, it nevertheless shared what the political scientist James W. Caesar called a common heart: hostility to modern liberalism, aka progressivism. For Caesar, writing in 2010, that common antipathy to left liberalism supplied energy to what he described as conservatism's 4 heads: traditionalism, neoconservatism, libertarianism, and the religious right. Each of the 4 heads, Caesar went on, had a specific foundational concept. For traditionalism, that concept was culture. For neoconservatism, it was natural right as apprehended through reason. For libertarianism, it was spontaneous order. And for the religious right, Caesar said, the foundational concept was revelation. Conservatism, Caesar wrote, can fulfill the role of being the philosophy of a governing party only if its 4 heads are properly arranged. What does the arrangement look like today? Where once there were 4 heads, now there are 2. Traditionalism and religion loom large on the right. Libertarianism is a beleaguered and bullied very junior partner. And neoconservatism, as Caesar understood it, hardly exists. Indeed, many of the names associated with the neoconservatism of the past 30 years have left the conservative movement and the Republican Party. For the traditionalists and religious right, turnabout is fair play. If they were to speak Caesar's language, they would put it something like this, I think. For too long, culture and biblical faith played second fiddle to natural right and spontaneous order. Then came Donald Trump, who broke the Beltway establishment and realigned the GOP and conservative movement in the direction of the populist grassroots. It is Donald Trump's party now, and both the GOP and conservative movement have taken on his confrontational politics, his domestic and foreign policy priorities, and his contempt for elites and self-described experts. The Reagan conservative values of individual freedom, personal responsibility, and American international leadership no longer predominate on the intellectual right. The past half-decade has seen the birth of a new right, the latest in a series. It's really the newest right, that prioritizes traditionalist culture and biblical faith. It wants to use state power to constrain left-wing institutions. It calls for an America First foreign policy of retrenchment and restraint. For the new right, Reaganism is the expression of a dead consensus that has conserved nothing, I'm quoting, and deserves condemnation rather than approval. For the opponents of Reaganism, the new right presents an opportunity to reverse the social and cultural changes of the past 30 or 40 years. The new right seeks to rectify political economy to the advantage of working-class male wage earners. It wants to abandon the foreign policy of intervention and nation-building for a position of neutrality and non-interference in foreign affairs. Not all Trump voters belong to the new right. This is an important distinction to make. And many supporters, I go on, of Donald Trump were once supporters of Ronald Reagan and continue to admire the 40th president and what he stood for. For the intellectual architects of the new right, however, Reagan's legacy is at best mixed. His political philosophy is suspect to them. Reagan belongs in the rearview mirror, along with the Soviet Union, madballs, and glam bands. The future, in their view, belongs to another creature of the 80s, Donald Trump, who, in the words of two of his supporters, and I quote, exposed the carnage caused by the neoliberal turn in American political economy and the neoconservative turn in foreign policy. And there you see two of those four heads, the neoliberal turn standing for libertarianism and, of course, neoconservatism. The differences between the Reagan conservative approach and that of the new right were visible just this month. One weekend in early October in Houston, Congressman Dan Crenshaw held his third annual Youth Summit. The Texas Tribune estimated the size of the crowd at a few hundred young conservatives. Whereas the post-liberal right seeks a definitive break from the hawkish small government conservatism of Ronald Reagan, Crenshaw wants to revive it. His two-day gathering was drenched in 80s nostalgia. He actually, and this I had to confirm this, he arrived on stage in a DeLorean, as if he were starring in Back to the Future. Reagan's voice regularly echoed through the hall. The lineup of speakers featured well-established figures in conservative media and politics. Radio talk show host Dennis Prager offered his plan to save Western civilization. Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street, delivered a motivational speech. Casino magnate Steve Wynn offered advice on how to become a billionaire. Rich Lowry, editor-in-chief of National Review, made the case for American nationalism. And Governor Greg Abbott discussed the migrant crisis on the southern border. That same weekend, 1,300 miles north of Houston in Steubenville, Ohio, another some 200 visitors to the Franciscan University heard from the leading lights of the new right's Catholic wing. Sohrab Ahmari, co-founder and editor of Compact, decried what he called private tyranny. Notre Dame's Patrick Deneen, author of Why Liberalism Failed, called for a new Marshall Plan to revitalize the former manufacturing centers of the Rust Belt, whose decline he attributes to global neoliberalism, libertarianism. Gladden Papin, a professor at the University of Dallas and deputy editor of the journal American Affairs, said, I quote, "Another world is possible, namely Hungary." Mary Imperato at this conference, she's of Belmont Abbey College, recalled a youthful desire to see a statue of Mary, Mother of Jesus, replace the Statue of Freedom atop the United States Capitol building. Harvard Law School's Adrian Vermeule, author of Common Good Constitutionalism, told the audience, quote, "There is no alternative to the administrative state, that is, the centralized bureaucratic authority that conservatives have always opposed. There is no dismantling of it," he said. "To dismantle it would be to dismantle the American constitutional order." Rather than limit or shrink the centralized bureaucracy, Vermeule wrote in 2018, he would have, and I quote, "non-liberal actors strategically locate themselves within liberal institutions and work to undo the liberalism of the state from within." The title of one of Thomas Sowell's greatest books, A Conflict of Visions, applies to the debate between Dan Crenshaw and Adrian Vermeule. The Steubenville faction's definition of liberalism encompasses not only modern progressive left liberalism, but also the classic conservative right liberalism that is part, not all, but part of the American right. The place of Hungary in the cosmology of the new right is revealing. This new right looks not to America's past for responses to today's challenges. It studies Europe's present. Let's return for a moment to Caesar's typology. One of the reasons he said that you need four heads, not two, is that neoconservative natural right and libertarian spontaneous order provide guardrails for traditionalist culture and religious faith. Natural right offers a criterion of judgment arrived at by reason, or, as Abraham Lincoln put it, a standard maxim for free society. That is, he said, I quote, I like this quote, "constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere." Spontaneous order, meanwhile, implies limits to state power. It says there ought to be places where government cannot reach. Without a belief in objective and universal moral standards, without a separation between the political sphere and the social sphere, the right becomes unconstrained, unbounded, and detached from the American experiment. Consider the manifesto issued earlier this year by the largest and most influential grouping on the new right, the National Conservatives, also known as NatCons. The NatCons Statement of Principles, published this summer, is an eloquent declaration of traditionalist and religious concerns and priorities. Many of its arguments for nationalism, two-parent families, colorblindness, technological research and development, and the rule of law fit comfortably in the American conservative mainstream. Yet it contains no reference to the Declaration of Independence. It contemplates a moratorium on all immigration to the United States, not just illegal immigration, all immigration. It suggests that federalism is fine, so long as states and localities do what the NatCons want. And it proclaims that the majority religion of any country, quote, should be honored by the state and other institutions, both public and private, close quote. The NatCons Statement of Principles is serious, it's substantive, it may have applications elsewhere, but it appears to me to be alienated from and antithetical to the principles of this nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. When I look at the new right, I can't help but think of the new left. As you know, beginning in the 1960s, the liberal establishment broke against the shoals of Vietnam and civil disorder. A new left, focusing on culture rather than economics, shook the foundations of the Democratic Party and captured the presidential nominating process in 1972. A similar phenomenon is now taking place on the other side of the political spectrum. But here, the causality is reversed. The new left's anti-establishment challenge culminated in its takeover of the Democratic Party. The new right, much to its surprise, began with control of the presidency in 2016 and is now marching through the Republican Party and conservative movement. The new right, like the new left, is anti-war, except in the culture. The new right, like the new left, is suspicious of and hostile to capitalism. The new right, like the new left, considers itself part of an international movement. The new right, like the new left, says that Russia is misunderstood. And the new right, like the new left, tends toward rhetorical overstatement and ad hominem attack. It has no time for manners and little patience with the democratic process. Where public opinion stands and how to move it are subjects left unaddressed in the plenary sessions of the new right's many conferences and in the pages of its media outlets. The new right reverses the new left's idea that the personal is political. For them, the political is personal. Disagree with their ends and means, and you are, and I just take one quote at random, a zombie and a human rodent who wants a shadow life of timid conformity. And for the record, that was not addressed to me specifically. It is important to recall the new left wasn't all that interested in conservatives back in the 60s. Its target was the liberal establishment and liberal elites and cultural and political institutions. The Berkeley sociologist Robert Nisbet, a well-known conservative, noticed that the radicals on campus in the 1960s completely ignored him. They focused their ire on the liberal professors. Many of the radicals, in fact, had read Nisbet's 1953 classic, The Quest for Community, and found it insightful. For the new left, the right was hopeless, almost irrelevant. Liberals were the real enemy. Similarly, when you read the new right today, you notice that they are more concerned with overturning the conservative establishment than they are with participating in or building a coalition in pursuit of a common objective against the left. Indeed, the new right exhibits the same strange new respect for left-wing thinkers, from Christopher Lasch to Carrie McWilliams to Michel Foucault to Slavoj Žižek, that the new left once bestowed on right-wing communitarians like Nisbet and libertarian anti-communists like the economist Murray Rothbard. Just as the liberal establishment cracked under new left pressure, conservative institutions have bent to the will of the new right. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute, launched by libertarians Frank Chodorov and William F. Buckley Jr. in 1953, has turned toward the new right. At the most recent meeting of the Philadelphia Society, a conservative discussion group founded by the arch-fusionist conservative Frank Meyer in 1964, speakers debated whether American institutions can still be conserved. One participant raised the possibility that the time may have come for a revolution against the federal government. The Conservative Political Action Conference, organized by conservative journalist and activist Stan Evans, the author whose last book was titled The Theme is Freedom, was founded in 1974, CPAC. But today, of course, it's better known by the the acronym TPAC. You don't need me to tell you what the T stands for. The latest president of the Heritage Foundation this is Ed Foldner's old institution, attended the most recent National Conservative Conference, where he said, I quote, "I come not to invite NatCons to join our movement, but to acknowledge that heritage is part of yours." More recently, he welcomed former Congressman Tulsi Gabbard, an ideological liberal Democrat best known for her harsh criticism of American foreign policy towards Syria and Russia, to the ranks of Heritage's third way, America First foreign policy. Some on the new right have become so disgusted with conservatism that they are willing to renounce the label altogether. The editors of American Affairs Journal reject conservatism for alternatives ranging from managerialism to post-liberalism to corporatism. The online compact magazine calls itself, admittedly, a radical American journal, a radical journal. Molly Hemingway, editor-in-chief of the Federalist webzine, said in her Bradley Prize acceptance speech last year that, quote, "All of a sudden, the conservative project is not a conservative one, so much as a counter-revolutionary one." As if to underscore her point, last week, a frequent contributor to the Federalist, John Daniel Davidson, wrote an article with the headline, I quote, "We need to stop calling ourselves conservatives." Davidson urges conservatives, or people on the right, to start thinking of themselves, quote, as radicals, restorationists, and counter-revolutionaries. Like earlier radicals, he is ready to chop some heads off the body of conservatism. The left will only stop, he writes, when conservatives stop them, which means, he goes on, conservatives will have to discard outdated and irrelevant notions about small government. The government will have to become, he continues, in the hands of conservatives, an instrument of renewal in American life, and in some cases, he says, a blunt instrument indeed. I want to make it clear that I believe the new right has legitimate gripes against the corrupted state of many American institutions. I think it is onto something about the radicalism of our cultural gatekeepers, about the stagnant economy of the early 21st century, and, indeed, the unintended consequences of foreign intervention. I am aware, as well, that William F. Buckley Jr. was once quoted as saying that he would rather be governed by the first 500 names in the Boston telephone directory than by the faculty of Harvard University. I know that populism will always be part of conservatism in America, and that common sense is a better guide to the world than expert opinion. I want you to understand that I am not opposed to what you might call a selectionist immigration policy, to strategic decoupling from China, to policies that benefit wage earners without college degrees, to parental involvement in education, and to treating the major tech platforms as common carriers. I'm not opposed in principle to any of these ends, because I believe they are in harmony with the American constitutional order. And it is that constitutional order that American conservatives are meant to defend. A constitutional order founded on the principle of human freedom and dignity. A constitutional order of enumerated powers and individual rights and religious freedom. An order designed to, quote, decide the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. A constitutional order in which the deliberate sense of the people is channeled through representative institutions into positive law that is intended to, I quote, form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity. Times change. People change. Movements change. The left changes. But human nature does not, and neither do the timeless truths of the American founding. American conservatism exists to remind the world of these facts and to apply those truths prudentially and moderately to the problems of the moment. If some on the new right no longer want to call themselves conservative, if they no longer want to be a part of the tradition of freedom, then we must let them go. And when conservatism has rediscovered its missing heads, when it recommits itself to the American idea of liberty under law, we will be able to say that the state of conservatism is strong. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. The floor will now be open for questions. Jonathan here has a a microphone. We'll begin with any students who might have questions. So let me encourage students to put their hands up first. Any student questions? I don't see any over here. James Drolet. Can you give James the microphone, Jonathan? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Continetti. Great to see you again.
James.
My question is about the New Right and their reading of American history. They would look back on the founding and not necessarily take the same perspective that you took. They wouldn't look necessarily to John Locke. They would look at the Puritan background of the founding and see America as a nation conceived as a Christian nation, with many of these sort of little platoons that had a strong social fabric based on Christian morality. And they would say, we're trying to restore that vision of America, a vision of America where without Christianity you can't actually have that natural ordered liberty in your state. So why isn't that a more accurate picture of a return to our American founding?
Sure, of course. Well, as I said, that right liberalism or classical liberalism is a part of the founding. It's not the entirety of the founding. There were ideals of ancient republicanism at work in the founding, and of course there was the Protestant spirit and the revival of the time at work in the founding. But I think it's important to note that American history did not stop in 1620 with the compact of the Puritans. That there was a great development between that period and the Declaration, and then a development between the Declaration and the Constitution. The conservative political scientist Wilmer Kendall, a very fascinating, eccentric man, once co-wrote a book. It was finished by one of his collaborators, George Carey, called maybe getting this wrong, the Major Symbols of the American Political Order. Basic symbols, right, basics. He begins with Mayflower, but he doesn't end there. And he was trying to say the constitutional vision is one that incorporates all of these symbols and balances them and recognizes that there's a place for them. I am in agreement with Wilmer Kendall on that. But that doesn't mean that we can simply eject the Declaration, eject some of those ideas that may or may not have been drawn by Locke, or may have been drawn by a Locke that may not be the Locke that people think they're reading today, right? In toto. You keep it all in balance. And the second thing I would say is the ideal of limited government is in the founding and is in the Constitution, clearly. And what that implies is a division between the political and the social. And so I am all for renewal of American Christianity. I'm for renewal in American Christianity, and I believe that renewal will be more legitimate if it's done through civil society, that if it's done through a new evangelism rather than imposed top-down. What better way than to alienate people by saying you have to believe something?
Can I just add something in view of James' question there, really for all the students? If you haven't read it, it's really worth reading a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to Henry Lee just a few months before his death on July 4th, 1812, on the 50th anniversary, literally on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Lee had asked him, where did you get the ideas for the American founding? Where did you get the ideas for the Declaration of Independence? And Jefferson says, well, there's nothing new in there. There's nothing original. I was just presenting the common sense of the American people as formed by its traditions, and then he refers to, and the standard books of political right. And then he quotes some names, Aristotle, Cicero, all the way up through Sidney and Locke. What he was putting his finger on there is the idea that there are streams that feed the American founding. That's your point, Matt. There's not just one stream. There are multiple streams that feed it. And if you put too much of the emphasis on any one of them, you'll distort the picture. You have to understand Athens, Jerusalem, Rome. All these traditions are coming together. Next question. Any other student? Yeah, so right over here, Jonathan. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming and for your fantastic talk. The thing that was fascinating to me is the progression of the right. And I'm just curious, how gradual do you think it is? Do you think it's like if you ask, like you can read the tea leaves and see where things are going? Or do you think there's an instigating factor that suddenly changes people's minds and and makes it mainstream, or do you think it's like more of a slow process?
That's a great question. So I think a couple of things. One is the financial crisis. It's clear to me that something changed in our politics beginning around 2008. Interestingly enough, that was also the year where Putin invaded his first country, Georgia, right, in August. And then the following month, we had the collapse of the world economy. And I think what the financial crisis did to politics worldwide was set it off on a different axis. And so whereas we had spent much of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st thinking about left-right axis, or spectrum, right? So left wants a bigger government in economics, right wants a smaller government in economics, left wants more individual freedom and morality, right thinks that morality needs to be informed by not just law, but also, of course, family, church, community. Suddenly we were turned in. Now the spectrum was, are you establishment or are you anti-establishment? Are you part of the group that was in charge when the global financial crisis occurred? Or are you rebelling against all of the causes of the financial crisis as well as the responses? And that's been very unsettling, but that has created this new divide, I think, within conservatism, that it's no longer so much about the principles that I was describing, but it's more, hold it, are you part of the establishment or are you an anti-establishment figure, right? And in fact, even isn't that like a new left thing? If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, right? Or the second thing that happened, I think, is the supercomputers we all carry around in our pockets. So even well into Barack Obama's presidency, Twitter and podcasts and now TikTok, social media was beginning to generate. It now completely absorbs our lives and really shapes everything in the way that we see the world. And it is the fact that the new right appeals to a lot of young people. And these young people, they don't know a world before the financial crisis. Everything they know has been one disaster after another, one overreach after another. And on top of that, because of the supercomputers in their pockets, they have access to every single idea. There's no mediation there. And it's a combination of those two things that I think that have set and propelled the new right to such heights in recent times.
Student questions. Jaden, over here. Jonathan, where are you? There we go.
Hi, Mr. Continetti. Thank you so much for your talk today. It was absolutely amazing. So my question is kind of with regards to how we can address some of the problems you just brought up. So obviously, the new right tends to appeal to a lot of younger demographics, which means that these people are going to be, I guess, like in the voting base for a very long time. So how do you think we can encourage that youth movement to sort of like engage in temperance and moderation with regards to their political ideals?
Well, it is a fact that that the new left, with its march through the institutions, moderated itself over time, and the democratic establishment also moved toward the new left in many of its views. That's not to say that the new left was the totality of American liberalism or of the Democratic Party. There continued to be kind of old school liberals. There continued to be kind of, contrarian thinkers like the editors at the old New Republic magazine, right? But a type of synthesis formed between the rising force and the establishment that it was challenging. I think something similar may happen. It is also possible that, and those quotes that I was reading toward the end, it is also possible that this movement may split off entirely and reject politics and reject the democratic process and thus delegitimize itself. That is entirely possible. But I think that my best case is that the conservative movement and the Republican Party find a way to acknowledge, to see, to recognize what it is that is fueling this discontent with the establishment, and we can name the reasons, I'm well aware of them, and to respond to it. That, I think, would be the way that most populist revolts have worked their way through the system in a constructive manner in American history.
I love showing off our students. Aren't those
great
magnificently
questions.
intellectually serious and morally serious questions? Any more students? Yeah, keep it up. Go ahead.
Thanks for speaking to us. I wanted to ask you about two groups that you kind of seem to categorize under the banner of the new right, namely the National Conservatives and the post-liberal right. And I'm kind of wondering how or if you delineate them. I know on the issue of foreign policy, the post-liberal right pretty clearly stakes out a non-interventionist approach, whereas the National Conservatives, they seem to me, ideologically speaking, to have a bit more of a consensus as to kind of squaring traditional precepts with this kind of new insurgency of culture. But I'm not so convinced from what I see that they are exactly non-interventionist. And sort of going off of that question, kind of the moniker of America First, do you see that falling more on the side of national conservatism or more so within the post-liberal right?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, America First, of course, has a history. And it was resurrected by former President Trump in 2016 when he gave a major foreign policy address. And he might have known what he was doing when he did it. I mean, I can't say with any certainty, but he is a World War II buff. We do know that. And so it's now become just kind of a slogan, a cliche, really, in the Republican Party. You know, we're going to put American national interest first, right? It's kind of shorn of all of the baggage because, quite frankly, most people don't know about the baggage that it carries from the pre-war period. On the other hand, you know, the earlier presidential aspirant who used America First, Patrick J. Buchanan, knew exactly what he was doing when he said it, and he agreed with the original America First, and still does. He wrote a whole book about it, that American intervention in World War II was a bad idea. So it is important to tease out these things. I would say this. I think I could have generalized about the new right much more easily prior to 8 months ago. Prior to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the new right was almost uniformly against American intervention, skeptical of foreign entanglements, didn't want to get involved. Ukraine shifted things, and it actually has created a split in the new right. So, I mean, this is like, you know, talking about intra-Marxist politics, right? So it's, you know, we're talking about 30 people here. But the NatCons that you mentioned, some of them are supportive of American assistance to Ukraine and to Taiwan on the very basis of their nationalist ideals, right? They see Ukraine and Taiwan as nations. And so if you support the principle of national sovereignty, it would be rather hypocritical to simply say that Putin can do whatever he wants, right? Or Xi can reunify China at his leisure. On the other hand, the post-liberals, the radicals, are against any assistance to Ukraine, right? So you see that split, and that's I think it's an interesting, you know, it's like kind of parsing out the differences between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, right? But in general, they're very opposed to American leadership on the world stage.
Next question. Yes, right behind you. Right up there. Yeah, just hand it back.
Hi, I'd like to thank you for speaking today. My question is about how, in your speech, you alluded to the importance of free expression and maintaining a open public discourse, but also in a response to the previous questions, you talked about the dangers of social media and having this marketplace of ideas where every idea is available for everyone, including children and the youth. How do you balance those two things?
It's a great question, and it's worthy of an entire semester, right?
Yeah, but you only have 5
I know,
minutes.
and I have 5 minutes. Look, I mean, I think you kind of alluded to one place to start in your question, which is first you have to make distinctions. You have to recognize that maybe children should not be participating in social media the way they are, for the very reason that they are children, right? John Stuart Mill on Liberty has this wonderful phrase, it's like tucked away, when he talks about full freedom of expression, harm principle, right? You can do whatever you want so long as you don't harm another person. And he has, I forget the exact wording, you probably know.
Except for children and barbarians.
Right. And barbarians, right? So, okay, that's a great caveat. And I think in our discussions of free speech and free expression, we neglect the fact that Mill kind of contained that verbal parachute there, right? But I would actually be more Millian than Mill, and I would say, yes, exactly. Let's focus on that, and let's start from there. That that's how we should condition. I'm not against the free exchange of ideas. I'm not against people, especially students, being exposed to the free exchange of ideas. What I worry about is that people believe that history began in 2016, and it didn't. And that's one of the, in truth, that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, so that I could literally, whenever I have a student say that they don't know any of this, I can hand them the book and say, read. Whether they listen to me or not is a different question, but at least I will have it there, that you say that's there. So I think that's, sometimes you come across an idea on the internet and you think, oh wow, that's amazing. And we don't recognize that probably, in fact, and almost certainly, that idea has been raised, and there are objections to the idea, and there's a development of the idea over time. I think that's what's missing, and we need to supply that.
Yeah, is that another student? Are you a student up there? Yes, over there, Jonathan.
Yes, so kind of directly to that point. I mean, you already mentioned Pat Buchanan, a lot of these figures that are being brought back, Kevin Phillips, disgusting enough, Sam Francis, all sorts of other kind of odd figures from the history of the 20th century America.
You would like my book, because you seem to be familiar.
All sorts of other kind of odd figures, all the, like, on the Catholic side, a lot of the arguments over, like, Triumph Magazine, things like that. Like, these are all kind of ideas and debates that have been had before to varying degrees.
We didn't set this up. You know about Triumph Magazine? That's just amazing.
That's the second Rick Bozell, right? I think.
Yeah, exactly.
You gotta keep count. But anyway, so there's all these people, kind of acting like history did begin in 2016. There was this brand new thing. There's these new coalitions, whatever else is going on. But all these kind of different factors of the new right, they're all bringing in kind of a lot of pre-existing ideas. Yeah. So I'm wondering how much of that is just people kind of tacking on prior ideological commitments? Like, is this like a kind of Schumpeterian, like, elite theory thing? Like, they just want to replace the current elites in conservatism with their ideas because they're new, they're young, they want to drive out the David Frenches of the world and kind of become their own movement. Mm-hmm. And how much is, like, actually substantively new,
right,
in any regard?
Well, that's a great question. What I would say is these ideas are old. The tendencies have been there since the post-war conservatism, and I go into them in my book, and you see kind of the repetition of the debates. What's different is 2016. What's different is Donald Trump became the president of the United States. And that changed everything, because when you're the president of the United States, you shape your party. If you're associated with the right, you shape the conservative movement, and of course you shape the country. And that is new. And so I had a version of this discussion once with a mentor and everything, and I was saying, these intellectuals are arriving at these conclusions or whatever about the new right, and he reminded me, he said, well, you forget that intellectuals like power, and Donald Trump presented the opportunity. And so I think that's a factor for sure. But I also don't say that, I'm not Paul Krugman. I don't attack people's motivations, right? I think people sincerely have ideals of the good that they want to see put in practice. And I believe many of those ideals on the left and on the new right are mistaken. But I don't doubt that they hold them sincerely, even if they coincide with professional ambition, because we're all ambitious. We all want to get somewhere.
For almost everybody in the room, I'm sure, Triumph Magazine was the 50s prototype of contemporary Catholic integralism. It challenged the movement at the time, led by figures like John Courtney Murray, toward a rapprochement of traditional Catholic social thought and American traditional constitutional ideals. It really represented the alternative, and it lost to the Murray project. And in some ways, although they are interestingly different as well, but in some ways, the contemporary post-liberals that met in Steubenville do represent a revival of the Triumph magazine of Brent Bozell.
Do you think they'll all end up in Hungary like Roselle ended up in Spain?
Good question.
I mean, they go there a lot. I mean, you can get second homes there, I guess.
So, students can continue to raise your hands, but I do want to recognize some other people. But before I do that, I want to, as some of you know, when I'm not teaching here, I'm a law professor at a law school in New England, and as a law professor, I get to call on people who haven't put their hand up. And I would be remiss if I didn't call on one of the great figures of contemporary political science we have with us today to see if he has anything to say about Matt Continetti's lecture. We have John DiIulio of the University of Pennsylvania, who is one of the great figures in contemporary political science. John, what's your perspective?
My perspective is it's a magnificent book. I read it. I also heard you talk from outside. I didn't want to interrupt.
I was wondering who was lurking back there.
Well, I cast a pretty big shadow on that. But I do have one. I'll try to make it a question or an assertion. So, and I'll paint with a very broad brush. At any given time, you have sort of multiple and competing conceptions of conservatism. And I'll say there's three different species of that discussion. One is intellectual. Ideas, people who write magazines, books, etc. The second is political, what politicians say and think they mean when they talk about being conservative or not conservative or this kind of conservative. And then the third category pretty much is what people think. These surveys say, are you conservative, liberal, very liberal, right? And I think at different periods of time, right, I would say the 1980s and the Reagan Revolution was a time when there was sort of a collect and cohere moment. What the intellectual leaders of conservatism were saying, what politicians who were considered themselves and were considered as conservative were saying, and what most people thought they were saying when they said, I'm conservative, was all pretty well aligned.
Yeah.
So William F. Buckley, you could read what Buckley was saying, and you could sort of hear it echoed on, the campaign trail in a congressional district, right? Today, and this is sort of the question / assertion I'd love to hear your comments on, it seems to me that this, and I don't know what to call it because I don't quite follow it as closely, but in Philadelphia we don't get involved in this stuff. This post-liberal Catholic integral. I haven't seen any congressional district where somebody's been running on integralism, right? I haven't seen. So it seems to me that what seems to be in the intellectual ascendant, we're getting a lot of attention and creating a lot of controversy. There aren't a lot of people in the political class, and certainly, surveys the mass public, you probably couldn't get, you get under 1% who could even begin to define it.
Right.
Does that matter? Does that make sense? Or do you see, is it cyclical in terms of how much there is a collect and cohere effect?
Yeah, that's a great point. I neglected to mention that one of the guests and speakers at Steubenville was Ohio Senate candidate J.D. Vance.
Oh, there you go. Well, he wrote a book, see, so he's in the intellectual class.
And now he's running for office, right? So I think that I would say it's just beginning. Because in addition to Vance, the Arizona Republican Senate candidate Blake Masters, I think, is familiar with and sympathetic to many of these ideas. Now, that's two. So if they both win, that's 2% of the United States Senate. But, Hawley is kind of already there. So 3. Rubio, he kind of tried it on for a little bit. He's not really, he's kind of moved away. Rubio, he's mutable, he's changeable. So 3.5. I look at that and I tend to agree. It's not representative. I think they look at that and say, that's the floor, right? I mean, this is the great bumper sticker that conservatives adopted after the 1964 loss, right? 27 million people can't be wrong. That Goldwater was the floor, not the ceiling.
Which turned out to be true.
And it turned out to be true.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, you had your hand up there for Jonathan. I hate to make you be jumping back and forth like this, but this gentleman up here has had his hand up for quite some time. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Enjoyed your book. A previous distinguished guest at this forum, George Will, has called Trump a malignant buffoon, and I agree. How how can we entrust the Republican Party to be the agent of constructive change when it remains in the thrall of a Codillo?
It's funny, your quote reminded me of what Charles Krauthammer said on the day that Trump announced, which he called Trump a rodeo clown. And then later he said he repented the rodeo. That led.
But he also didn't think Trump could win.
Yes, no. But that also led Trump to retaliate as he did. And when Charles's book, Things That Matter, came out in paperback, Trump tweeted out a copy of the cover and said, Charles Krauthammer's Things That Matter, now in paperback. Book sucks. And Charles always said that he wanted to put that on the next edition as a blurb. Your question is dead on, in my view. It's dead on, in my view. The future is in Donald Trump's hands. Will he run for president? Will he be serious about it? If so, he starts off as the front runner for the Republican nomination, and all these trends will continue, if not magnify.
So you don't believe DeSantis could knock him off in a primary?
Well, we'll see. I said we start at the front runner. One of the adages of politics that I learned from my mentor, Fred Barnes, is that the Republican Party always nominates the front runner, but not before humiliating him first. And that ended up not being the case in 2016 because Jeb never got it, but he was humiliated. So if DeSantis runs, it will be a contest. And I think DeSantis presents the best hope for people like me in the sense that he's not totally where I am, but he is that synthesis of where I am and where the new right is. And there are others who are doing it. I think Glenn Youngkin is doing the same thing. And there will continue to be, to the earlier question, I think there will continue to be candidates who try to fit these things together in some way. But as long as Trump is there, he is that tropical depression changing the weather. And that's just going to continue.
Though I wonder why, in response to that gentleman's question, part of your answer isn't, well, Youngkin managed and therefore showed how you can win without embracing Trump.
Right. The question is, can you do that at the presidential level?
Yeah.
And I do think, though, if the story out of this election is that Ron DeSantis is reelected with 5 to 8% majority, lead, right, margin, and wins the Hispanic vote, and that becomes the big story of the election. He is not ruled out running. He keeps that open. His wife wants him to run for president this time, right? That if he decides that he wants to announce his presidential candidacy prior to Trump, I think that flummoxes things up. Because right now, Trump just assumes that he can keep everyone out. He can run the tape out on these investigations. He can decide that he's announcing for president, and then he gets a coronation. If DeSantis somehow interferes with that, then we could have a very different nomination process.
Down here, Jonathan, can you?
Hello, yes, thank you. I'd like to preface this question by outing myself. I'm a democratic socialist. I came here planning not to agree with a single word you said. But surprisingly, and to my great pleasure, I actually did find myself somewhat agreeing with some of what you said. And I want to talk a little bit about this idea of the new right and this idea of this American Christian country. Are you afraid in any way that, let's say, this new right could lead us into like a theocracy, we'll say? Because it seems like they keep peddling this idea of, this Christian country, which goes against the separation of church and state. So I wonder, is this a significant problem of the conservative movement? Is this something that you guys are going to have to deal with?
I think you have to kind of surmount the political challenges that Professor Giulio was talking about, which is that, in rhetoric, there may be calls for some type of, public religion, which in my view is different from religion in the public square. Some enfranchise, some franchise of religion, and then the actual reality of implementing it. I think one of the most, and I didn't mention it in my talk, but one of the most significant sociological developments of the past decade is the collapse of religious affiliation in the United States. So, in fact, this new right's radical vision may be a response to that, right? we go through periodic debates over whether the Republican Party is going to impose a theocracy on the United States of America. Walter Mondale got in trouble in 1984 by likening Reagan to the mullahs in Iran because of the embrace of the religious right in the 1984 Republican Convention. We get through it because I think the American constitutional system is strong enough that it wouldn't bend to that sort of thing.
Brad Wilson?
Thanks. Hi, Matt. It's great to have you back to Princeton.
Yes.
You may remember the conference we did on the legacy of the publication
I
of
do.
public interest.
I'm flattered that you remember I was there.
Oh, yeah. Well, you wrote it up.
I did. Yeah, I did.
I appreciated that.
It's a great conference.
There is religion being imposed on the United States. Wokeism, that's the theocracy. But I wanted to say my favorite NatCons are Washington, Hamilton, Madison. I think they qualify. If you wanted to save your neck from the right-wing Jacobins today, I would advise that you do more than not object to the things you agree with that they're doing. Enthusiastically endorse those things and use your mighty pen to advance those particular policy issues.
Then I wouldn't be as disagreeable, though. You know.
Yeah.
Somehow I'm always find myself in the condition that I have to disagree with my friends. Yeah.
Let's see. I had one more point I wanted to make, and that is that you spoke well about how this new right is viciously attacking other parts of the conservative movement, and of course this isn't the first time. I think of someone who was kind of a mentor, as were the people he was attacking, and that's Harry Jaffa, who represented the natural right, rule of reason aspect of conservatism.
Mm-hmm.
And from that vantage point, he attacked traditionalists, I guess you could call Irving Kristol a traditionalist, and fellow natural rights conservatives like Walter Burns and so forth. And I would say of that debate, it's the school of Jaffa that still is very much present in American conservatism through his students and the Claremont Institute and so forth. So it's not a new thing.
It's not a new thing, and this is in the weeds, I know, but I think you're right to say that they've continued his rhetorical approach, but I think they've forgotten a lot of his teaching. That'd be the way I put it.
To translate it out of the code.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
For the rest of the audience.
Just wanted to move on.
So the Claremont folks, the Claremont Straussians, the students of Jaffa, have moved in a Trumpy direction.
But I mean, not just Trumpy. You get, Harry Jaffa, of course, was a great student of Lincoln. His book, Crisis of the House Divided, I commend to everyone in this room. It's the most amazing book. And yet the publication associated with the Claremont Institute recently published a long essay on Robert E. Lee in which he was described as the moral conscience of half the nation. And I can only imagine what Harry Jaffa would have said.
Can I myself take the floor to ask you really a 60,000 foot question? This is about the conservative movement broadly and historically. I'll put it in the form of a proposition, and then you can tell me whether you agree or disagree or why it's complicated or what have you. If you know some of my own work, and I stress the important differences between European conservatism, which tends to be blood and soil thrown and altar conservatism, and American conservatism, which tends to be constitutional conservatism. In a certain sense, American conservatives are old-fashioned Madisonian Tocquevillian liberals. They're not the defenders of the ancien regime of Europe. But even I, who stress that distinction between the two forms of conservatism, recognize that the modern conservative movement has, to a very considerable extent, both in Europe and in the US, Europe including the UK, whether you count that as Europe or not these days is complicated, but the modern conservative movement was developed with a particular concern and fear in mind. It's an artifact of the Industrial Revolution. And the great fear, what conservatives feared, and what those on the left hoped for, was that a radicalized working class would overthrow the traditional economic, political, cultural, and religious structures of the society. And so many of the tools and understandings and concepts that drove conservatism, both here and in Europe, were fashioned with that fear in mind. And they were very effective tools and concepts, and they worked. The Marx's vision failed. There was no revolution and rising up of the working class and dictatorship of the proletariat. The left has had a hard time explaining why it didn't happen. Gramscian Marxism is an attempt at an explanation. To some extent, Frankfurt School Marxism is an attempt at an explanation. But in any case, it didn't happen. The working class, if anything, bought into and became supporters of the traditional institutions, the cultural, the religious, the economic institutions. But today, the conservative movement, both in Europe and here, faces really something quite different and unprecedented. And that is a radicalized managerial and professional class that has no love of those traditional institutions, economic, cultural, moral, religious. And the conservative movement is still working with the old tools, the old concepts, the old ideas. And I just wonder, are they fit, since they were fashioned for one sort of challenge, for this very different challenge?
I think that's definitely true in the European context. I do think that American conservatism is distinct in the 20th century as well, which is there's always kind of the sense among the conservatives post-New Deal, post-FDR, that they were on the outs. And so if you read, say, the founding statement of the National Review published in 1955, it's filled with kind of shots at judges, right? There's a great, throws a great zinger at Oliver Wendell Holmes, and he goes after the media. He goes after this old columnist named Jimmy Weschler, right? And so even then, and of course, William F. Buckley's first book, God and Man at Yale, a complaint that Yale was woke, or that version of it in 1951, if you can believe it, right? So I think in the post-war era, there's always been this sense that the conservatives actually do align with the people, rather than these kind of professional or radicalized elites at the top tiers of our culture. The question becomes, how to combat them. I think a lot of the frustration is that 70 plus years after the Second World War, we still have a lot of elites who are radical, right, and left, as you say. The actual challenge that conservatism has been fighting for decades hasn't been surmounted. And that causes many people, especially younger people, to think, well, we need to turn to alternative approaches. But that's why I point to the progress that's been made. I think it's interesting that the greatest advances for the conservative movement, other than the defeat of communism, which was the central mission of the conservative movement and was accomplished, have been made in economics and law. And those are both places where the conservatives worked within institutions, actually worked within the academy, right? Chicago School, right? And they set up counter institutions and it's, if you listen to all of the critics of neoliberalism, they're complaining at how effective Milton Friedman and Hayek were, right? And the same thing applies to jurisprudence and constitutional law. So I would hope that the right would take cues from those successes as they formulate ways to meet the challenges of today.
Jonathan, where are we? Oh, here you go. I think Professor Burns, did you have your hand up? Yep. Thank you, Matt.
That's a great question. Thank you very much, Matt, for a wonderful talk. One of the things that I've noticed looking at blogs on the new right is a sense of betrayal, not just of disappointment, but of betrayal. One of their favorite words is grifters.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could address that. You mentioned, for example, that there's recent progress on school choice. That was
part of the 1994 contract with America,
Right.
and it didn't seem as if anything had been done. You mentioned the need, I think rightly, for the new right to come back to constitutionalism, rule of law. But one of the heads of the four heads, Bill Kristol, said that a few years ago, if the deep state is going after Donald Trump, then I'm all in favor of the deep state. That's not a support of constitutional law. Those who helped Governor Youngkin win were people who might be described as new right, especially when it comes to educational policy. And some of those were immediately investigated by the FBI. Has there been a constant leftward drift that calls itself moderation in the Republican Party, but really amounts to accommodation? Mm-hmm. And has that provoked this sense of betrayal?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot there. I mean, it wasn't Republicans investigating those anti-CRT activists. It was a politicized Justice Department. It was a politicized IRS under the Obama administration that went after the Tea Party groups. As I recall, the Republican House investigated that. And I assure you that the Republican Congress will get into all of this next year. I can say with authority, I don't think Bill Kristol considers himself a conservative and didn't when he tweeted that. So I wouldn't count that as speaking for one of the four heads I mentioned. But look, I think you're right. There is a constant sense of betrayal. In fact, that's not new either. In fact, in 1972, Patrick Buchanan published a book called, or maybe it was 1974, after Watergate, he published a book called Conservative Votes, Liberal Victories. And there's no question that a political party and elected officials are unreliable, right? And there has been disappointment. I think a great spur to the rise of the new right was the Obergefell decision. I know from my students who are on the new right or in the religious right, that decision radicalized them. And that is not likely to be reversed. Okay, that decision is not likely to be reversed.
Give us 49 years.
Maybe, and another two. It would take another 2 generations, I think. Right?
We did it once.
So there is that sense of betrayal. I agree. I also think that utopian expectations belong on the left, not on the right. I think that I consider myself a conservative. As a conservative, I think of myself as a realist. I have to take the world as it is. You're not going to get everything, and things are going to take a long time, and you're going to lose along the way. And the expectation of total victory in every circumstance immediately is just not something I comprehend. I mean, I get it. I understand what the sentiments you're voicing. I understand, and that is powerful, and it does motivate them. But I do think the conservatives have plenty to cheer about, as much as they have to lament.
Professor Cooper, was your hand up before? But you were at Steubenville for the conference. Right? I was. Yeah. Why don't you tell us your perspective?
Oh my, I'm on the spot now. Well, I want to thank you for a very astute articulation of the differences that have arisen in conservatism. Particularly, I saw them on display at Steubenville. And I'm working on the common good and on common good constitutionalism, so these are of particular interest to my research. So I'm wondering if there's a way in which we might imagine the common good as being congruent with more mainstream conservatism as you describe it. And if not, if there is a way to harmonize it and bring some sort of unity to conservatism without which electoral victory, which is what is needed to accomplish any of the things you've mentioned, would be impossible to attain.
Well, I don't think my answer will, I don't know, but it might not satisfy many people in the room, but I think a lot of work was done on that by the philosopher Michael Novak. And I think Michael Novak's legacy has been rejected when it's not been forgotten. And I would hope that we would see a revival of his thought and exploration of it. I know that there are serious theological criticisms of him, but I think that he did arrive at a certain place reconciling the common good with the American constitutional order and a realm of human freedom. And I'm very sympathetic to his views.
Since I've got the two of you, let me ask this question. And I'll again put it in the form of an assertion, and then you both can argue with it. The assertion is this, that I think it's a mistake that has been made on both sides of the divide to assume that conservatism has to make a choice between being a philosophy of freedom and a philosophy of the common good. And that if we opt for the principles of the American founding, against, for example, Patrick Deneen's critique, if we opt for the principles of the American founding, we need to remember we're opting for the full set of principles. Not only the limited nature of the national governments, the government of delegated and enumerated powers, but also for the authority of the states as governments of general jurisdiction, precisely to protect, to exercise police powers, to protect public health, safety, and morals, and to advance the common good. It's not a question of freedom or the common good. It's a question of where the common good will, what the political locus of regulation and decision-making, lawmaking will be for the sake of the common good within the constitutional constraints that protect freedom. Is there any reason either of you would disagree with that?
I personally don't. I mean,
Sean, does that load the dice against the common good, do you think? Or?
I think that perhaps on certain large-scale national issues, such as, for example, abortion, perhaps there would be some reticence there. And I think that's what Adrian is getting to, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the delegation of authority, that Congress has effectively voiced its concern and said, well, we don't want to handle this, we're going to hand it over to the executive to handle it nationally. But personally, I think that that does offer a fairly unifying route between the common good and personal liberty.
I think even on that issue, at least if you take the perspective that I've defended and John Finnis and others have defended, the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause does provide a constitutional basis for the exercise of federal authority to protect human persons at all stages and in all conditions. Other questions? We just have a few more minutes left. You've had your hand up for some time, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I was wondering about your thoughts on the current discourse about critical race theory. So there's obviously a strong support within the Republican Party for regulating certain ideas in public schools. Do you view that as a constitutional overreach or a betrayal of conservative values, or is that something you support?
Well, the first thing I would say is to reference Professor George's words on the locus of authority. I do think education is a local issue. I think that's the way it was meant to be handled in the United States. I also think it's a familial issue. So I do believe the locus of authority there is in school boards. I do think school boards and parents, through their activism and through their election of school board members, should play a role in what is taught in schools and what books are available in public schools and public libraries. I do believe that. I think that once I state that general position, I then think it's a matter of cases. Okay. When I see in the New York Times that the New York Times cannot print the content of some materials that are being challenged in schools because the New York Times believes that they're obscene, I think maybe they shouldn't be available to children. As a parent, that's what I'm speaking. If it's too obscene for the New York Times, maybe we don't, we kind of keep it out of the reach of the kids. That's my view. However, I do note that there has been overreach at the local level. And I've heard stories of local school boards wanting to ban from schools storybooks about Ruby Bridges. And I seriously...
But also, on the other side, Huckleberry Finn.
And Or To Kill a Mockingbird. And there, my position is all of that needs to be available. So I do think it's a matter of cases. Once we just get to the general position, which is not agreed with by many, that I do think parents and local school boards should be the ones making those decisions. In fact, one of the reasons I think we found ourselves in this cul-de-sac is that the right forgot about the school boards. I recall when I was 25 years ago, when I was reading Professor Duilio's textbook, the conservative right, the Christian right, was very active at the school board level, very active in Fairfax County, Virginia, and then it vanished. And then they woke up one day, and all of a sudden, this new crew had come in and totally changed the curriculum. So I think attention to these authorities is a good thing. And I also think that the pandemic played a huge role. It created a moment of radical transparency where all of a sudden America's parents saw what was being taught or not taught. And the American parents reacted in horror.
Matt, if we shift the question up then to the state universities, there have been some efforts by conservatives in the state legislatures and sometimes boards of regents to restrict critical race theory in universities. That seems to me unjustifiable. Do you agree?
I may actually have a slightly different view. I think it's how you define it. And this is, of course, the problem. And again, I think it's a matter of being very specific about what it is. But there, too, I do believe that public institutions are publicly accountable. I got into trouble with my friends after the bailouts when I said in 2009 that Congress should restrict the bonuses of the Wall Street executives that we bailed out. I mean, they took the money, right? So this is that neoconservative head popping up, as it tends to do. So I might have a slightly different view.
I've outed myself again as the last real liberal. Any other questions before? Oh, Judge, let me give you an opportunity.
Thank you. It seems to me that the aim of all of these groups, conservative, liberal, neo, this and that, is to attain power. The great aphrodisiac. Now, most of these people will say, will not say it out loud, but if you've got the power, then you can accomplish what you want to accomplish. And I think the problem with many of the, put it this way, feeling of betrayal among a lot of people is that the politicians, the conservatives, are pulling their punches.
Mm-hmm.
They're not. That's what made Trump popular.
No, I know.
Because Trump fought back. He didn't take all this stuff.
He fights.
What do you think?
I think that's one of the arguments for Trump. I think that a signal moment in the development of this tendency that I've described was in, I believe it was the second or the third presidential debate in 2012 when this moderator, a reporter for CNN, erroneously corrected GOP nominee Mitt Romney, and Mitt Romney didn't do anything.
Yeah.
And from that moment on, I think the conservatives who had always despised the media, I mean, that's, again, a long-running theme, felt that they needed someone who would call that, if they felt challenged. And I think that did lead into Trump, for sure. I will say this about power. I already established that, I believe that basically people enter politics to do their vision of the good. You're right, that often means acquiring power. But for that very reason, we need the rule of law and constitutional structure to channel that power to beneficial ends, to distill the power, to constrain the power. And so I wouldn't want us to adopt a view that it's all power, and so nothing really matters anymore. What that calls for is instead a reassertion of the constitutional structure and the rule of law. And when it's abandoned by executive agencies, it requires correction. I'm totally for that. And it also requires public servants who will make the correction. But to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think, would be just a tragedy.
Well, Steve, I think Brother Continetti has done Beth proud. Please join me in thanking
Thank you very much.